let's get started. The first thing we're going to start with is the basic dominant chord in a major key. So we're going to use all our examples in the key of C or C minor. So let's start with major. In the key of C major, the dominant chord is G7. This sound, you'll find it everywhere in any major standard of the 30s, of the 40s, of 50s, and well beyond as well. So this chord, what do we play over it to sound idiomatic? And how would musicians of the 30s, of the 40s, 50s improvise over a G7 chord? So obviously, you can play some kind of G7 idea, like a G7 arpeggio. In terms of modern music school education, they say like G mixolydian. You may certainly hear such sounds in recordings, but you have to keep in mind that in those days, people didn't think too much in terms of modes because such terms didn't really exist. Musicians in those days were thinking in terms of voice leading and in terms of general harmony and voice leading combined together. Just because a chart may say G7 to C doesn't mean that you play a G7 idea over G7. In fact, what was very typical in those days was to play D minor over G7. And D minor, if you guys know a little bit of music theory, is what we call the 2 chord. 2, 5, 1. Okay? And why does that work? Because if you have a D minor triad, D, F, A, and you superimpose it over G7, you basically get G9. One of the most typical chords out there in jazz music. And it's interesting because by playing specifically the notes of a D minor chord, D, F, A, you're essentially skipping the note G, right? But that has a certain flavor, so to speak. The rhythm section is playing the G7, but you, in your soloing, are playing that. Now, of course, you can also play D minor and add the 6. By adding the 6, it makes the G7 even more prominent. Now, when I say playing D minor, it doesn't mean strictly the notes of D minor arpeggios. You start with that. But of course, you can play scalar ideas. You can decorate with other notes. It can be something like this. Just like that. Try that over a G7 chord. A, D, E, F, G, A. See, that's considered to be in the realm of D minor. And I think that sounds kind of bebop-y. To see. And indeed, how you choose to approach the realm of D minor will create different sounds. For example, if you wanted to sound in the old style, kind of Louis Armstrong, you have this kind of sound. Sorry. If you want it to sound more bebop-ish, you play stuff like that. Again, this lesson will not be about, I'm not teaching you idiom in a specific way like that. For that, it's another topic. You have to check out different players of different eras to understand why something sounds maybe bebop and why something sounds more trad jazz. I can't reduce it to a formula. Okay, so that's something you have to explore on your own. I just want to explain to you the basic underlying concept. So it's very typical on a G7 chord in the key of C to think something in the realm of D minor. So I have backing tracks for you of a G7 to C progression. But because in modern jazz, what is very typical is you'll hear, instead of just G7 for 2 bars to C, you will hear 1 bar of D minor, often D minor 7 to G7 to C. That's 2, 5, 1. They are essentially the same thing. Historically speaking, in the old days, people just stayed on G7 in the accompaniment. and it was the soloists who implied the 2 chord. But at one point, namely towards the 40s, I'm not saying it wasn't done in the 30s, but towards the 40s, people started to embrace the 2 sound a lot more, and more specifically the 2 minor 7 sound. And that's what I did in the backing track. Instead of playing G7 to C, I played D minor, G7, C. But I want you to think of them as the same thing, one or the other. If you want to sound more 1930s or 1920s, you just play G7 to C. And if you had to play a D minor, a 2 chord, you play D minor 6 to G7 to C. That is more typical of the 30s and the 20s. 40s, you play D minor 7 to G7 to C. But especially starting in the 50s. But in the 40s, actually, it's kind of a transition period. You'll hear some rhythm sections just playing 1 chord, like G7 to C still. And some players will play D minor. So it's interesting, looking at music history that way. I learned all this by listening to the music directly. Listen to the source. You can do the same, and you'll hear these things yourselves. Okay? So this is what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to play some examples for you. I'll try to mix the idioms a little bit. I'll play some in kind of a gypsy jazz or swing track jazz influenced styles. And I'll give you some examples that are sounding a little bit more bebop. So hopefully you can at least get a taste for idiomatic phrasing or note choices. But the most important thing is I'm in the realm of D minor over this chord progression. Okay? Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is the concept of substitution. Musicians who are improvising in the jazz styles, like Louis Armstrong, one of the earliest improvisers, famous improvisers anyway, use substitutions as well. And in those days, still even like nowadays, but how they came up with these substitutions was through voice leading. Voice leading is how you connect notes from one chord to another. So one of the most typical substitutions in early jazz is what we call the 4 minor substitution. So what we're going to do, since we have 2 bars of G7 or 1 bar of D minor and 1bar of G7, what we're going to do, we're going to think 1 bar of D minor in our improvisation, then 1 bar of F minor with a D natural, which creates D minor 7 flat 5. And what that does is this. To C. So actually D minor 7 flat 5 or F minor 6, however you want to call it, is quote unquote wrong over G7. But it's a question of voice leading, of this. You have the note A, which is the 5th of D minor or the 9th of G7, going down to A flat. I think that's how the musicians discovered such things. They discovered chords, chord progressions hidden inside melodies. And they filled the holes with chromaticism. By taking a D minor chord and taking the A down a half step, there's a hidden F minor. I think that's how they discovered such things. So Louis Armstrong used this sound. So let me record some examples for you with the backing track. Again, I'm going to try to mix the styles a little bit so you can hear different flavors. Next sound we're going to explore is the augmented sound. Very, very typical in early 1930s jazz. And I don't have any proof of this, but I think this is kind of what people did to get a kind of altered sound, if you guys have studied a little bit of jazz, before using the altered sound. You get this chord augmented. G augmented is G, D, D sharp. And you should practice the arpeggio, of course, on your fingerboard, on your guitar. Use whichever fingering you think might be good in any given position. There are no rules. And so what's very typical, again, is to do this voicing. It's all a matter of voicing. We're going to take a D minor chord again, or rather a G7 chord with a 13. When you do this, you essentially get a D minor with a ninth. Here I do a D minor 9. But check it out. To augment it leads very nicely. So I'm going to give you an example. Charlie Parker used this as well. Bebop players use this sound as well. And then eventually, I think people gravitated towards what we call the altered sound, which is not something we're going to talk about in this course because that's a little bit of a later thing. That started to become very prominent, common towards the 50s, actually. Not so much in the 30s. In the 40s, people started to kind of experiment with it, but in the 50s, you start to hear it a lot. I want to talk mainly about 30s and 40s. But still, we're going to touch upon the altered sound a little bit later on. So let me record some examples for you. Swing style and maybe bebop style. So there we go. Those are the typical sounds in the early jazz days, 30s, 40s, over a dominant chord. So it's very interesting. If you have the 2 minor chord and you add the 6, essentially you're still playing G7. You're just not playing the note G. So adding the note G is not wrong, but removing it in your phrasing, it just creates this kind of interesting sound. You can play D minor. When I say D minor, it can be D minor 6 kind of sound, D minor 7, D minor triad. We're not going to go there, but even D minor major 7, it creates a bit of an outside sound. That's a little bit more modern, but in the realm of D minor. I think in one of my examples, I had some kind of A flat in the line. So even that A flat is kind of outside the key of C, and also outside the realm of D minor. The rest of it is still in the realm of D minor. Again, I'm not here to teach you idiomatic jazz improvisation specifically. So to know how to use such sounds, you might have to look a little bit elsewhere. Okay, so I'd like to move on.